I recently had a YouTube commenter leave a comment below one of my videos. I think it was one of my developmental editing videos. And they kind of took exception with the fact that I say, if you are writing a nonfiction book other than a memoir, you don't need a developmental edit. This commenter took issue with that and says, what do you mean? I would say that nonfiction editing requires more work than a fiction developmental edit. What are you on about? And honestly, this commenter was correct. Although it was a misunderstanding, well, not a misunderstanding, it was me misspeaking, I should say. When I say developmental edit, basically what I'm talking about is correcting and critiquing the story of a fictional narrative or a memoir, which is structured like a novel. I consider nonfiction editing to be a service in and of itself because it's so different and requires such different things. The structure of nonfiction is not the same as the structure of fiction, regardless of what kind of fiction it may be. And so I personally don't refer to it as a developmental edit. I just call it a nonfiction edit. And yes, it is more work than a fiction developmental edit, and it costs more because of that. In an attempt to rectify my perhaps inaccurate and poor use of terminology, I thought I would make a video explaining exactly what makes nonfiction editing so different from fiction editing, explain the price differential, and explain what perhaps you should be looking for in your editor if you have a book-length nonfiction work that you want to be edited before publication. Let's dive in. Hello, shameless writers. I'm Krista McTiernan, the nonsense-free editor, here for your regular dose of writing and editing wisdom. Like I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about nonfiction editing today, specifically book-length works. We're not talking about white papers. We're not talking about technical reports or dissertations. We are talking about nonfiction books that are not memoirs. Before we dive in, I do want to mention that nonfiction ghostwriting also is more expensive than nonfiction editing, though for kind of a different reason, honestly. Nonfiction ghostwriting, including memoirs, just requires a lot more time and effort. Unlike for fiction, generally for nonfiction, a ghostwriter has to interview the client a lot. Lots of conversation, lots of times, lots of checking in. Hey, during our call, I forgot to ask you XYZ. Can you give me some details? I need some dates. I need this. I need that. And then you have the research on top of that. So ghostwriting nonfiction is also more expensive. But today, we're going to be focusing on the editing portion of it. When an author completes an informational or instructional or even a motivational nonfiction book, chances are your editor will be obliged to do one of several things where they would not be required to do them for fiction. One option is research. I'm not going to go so far as to say that this is fact-checking, particularly if it's more on the motivational end of things. But sometimes in motivational books, people will make claims or they'll make references to other published works. I would argue it is incumbent upon the editor, and this is a task I certainly perform, to kind of check to make sure these details are correct. Oh, you said Who Moved My Cheese came out in 2004. That might be right, but I don't think it is. Let me check that for you. This kind of fact-checking is not something a fictional editor would do. We all know the meme on the internet where basically any kind of silly old quote is going to get attributed to Gandhi or Theodore Roosevelt or Eleanor Roosevelt or any kind of famous person. I once saw I'm not going to say it was a bad quote, but it was a very lengthy diatribe about how you should have hope and believe in God and, things will work out for the best. The quote, dear reader, was attributed to George Carlin. If you're my age or older, you see the problem. George Carlin would never say any of that ever, and he would mock anyone who did. So, as the editor, it was my job to Google who actually said this, and I don't remember the lady's name, but she was a motivational speaker. She wasn't a stand-up comedian. She wasn't an ardent atheist. And she wasn't an anti-establishment type. Far from it. She was just your regular crunchy granola, fuzzy, feel-good kind of motivational speaker. Which made sense because the words that she said were in that line. George Carlin would never say that. I, as the editor, have the responsibility to make sure that my client doesn't put out misinformation, at least to the best of my ability. Those things take time. When we're talking about informational nonfiction, very often there's a strong research component to it as well. Even if you are working as an editor and not as a ghostwriter, there are some clients who will say, okay, well, I've finished my manuscript and I've mentioned where I got the information. However, I didn't have the time or the inclination to make the footnotes or the endnotes or the proper citation that the target reader will expect in this kind of book. Not all books require this, but some do, and you better have it. That's perfectly fine. That is part of the service. As long as I can Google it, as long as I can find it, or in the case of one client, God bless her, she sent me the physical hard copy books that she wanted me to cite because she wasn't sure. She had kind of summarized the points from the book. She didn't cite them word for word, but she wanted me to. Some of those books were only available in hard copy. They were not in ebook available, and there wasn't a web copy that she could do. So instead of scanning them, she bought the copies on Amazon and mailed them to me. I do not recommend this, for the record. It was overkill. Although I do have some really good books now that I would not have otherwise had. If you are a doctor, or if you are a scientist, or if you are writing about something that is evidence-based, having these types of citations is extremely important. It's also important that they be cited correctly. It's not enough that you can just Google it and find it. You want to make sure that they're reading exactly what you are referring to, particularly if you're doing academic research. Peer-reviewed articles, I got to tell you, often they have the same authors. They have lots of authors. Peer-reviewed articles will have up to 12 to 20 authors, which is ridiculous, you guys, for serious. They also have very similar titles. So if you Google something, you want to make sure that you have the DOI. So my job as an editor, and thankfully I have a background in editing dissertations and theses, I know how to cite things properly, and I know to ask my client what format they would like those citations to be in up front. Would you like APA, which is most common? Would you like MLA, which is most common in the language arts? Or would you like AP, which is most common for journalism and books? And just to specify, yes, APA is different than AP. It's fun. Something that fiction and nonfiction do have in common is the importance of structure. A lot of the work that I do when I'm editing a novel and when I'm editing an informational nonfiction book comes down to the structure. Is this an appropriate first chapter? Is it going to grab the audience's attention? How is the pacing? Are we going from kind of more tense, more rapid fire text to kind of more languid, relaxing chapters? Are they spaced correctly? Are we front loading all of the information and or plot points, or are we spacing them out properly? Do we have a satisfying ending? In the case of nonfiction, it would be something like a call to action, whereas in fiction, it would be the climax. The structure really matters, and it's not that one is harder than the other. I'm trying to say this politely. When I get a nonfiction book, a lot of times the structure needs more work because people will write in a very linear fashion. Okay, well, this is how I learned it and this makes sense to me. And it might make sense the way that they've written it, but it's not entertaining. The thing about a nonfiction book, even if it includes very dense technical information, this is a nonfiction book. It's not a white paper. It's not a technical paper. So it needs to be at least a little bit entertaining. So sometimes, particularly when it's more dense information, I do need to do more work with the structure, the chapter ordering, and sometimes getting rid of chapters just to make it palatable to the general population. Because like it or not, even if your ideal reader is someone in your industry who knows what you're talking about, dude, this is going to be on sale at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Are you saying that the layman shouldn't read your book? Because if that's what you're saying, I humbly recommend you publish this as a peer-reviewed journal instead of a book. And yes, it's my job to tell you that as your editor too. The final thing about nonfiction that makes it a little bit trickier is the subject of voice. See, when you're editing or when you're ghostwriting, you need to make sure that the work sounds like the author. You don't want to supplant the author's voice with yours. No one is buying your book, fair editor. They're buying your client's book. So preserving, or if you need to, inserting a voice is important. This is very true with, again, this dense intellectual information. If you have someone who has just written a book of how-tos, here are the resources you can find, very straight down the line advice. There's not much personality in there, is there? There's no voice that the reader can glom onto. Who is this guy? Where is he from? Why is he talking to me like he's my math teacher? The thing about voice is that it's easy to screw up. I do have a ghostwriting client where I recently wrote his book, Chris Orzechowski's The Moat. I made a boo-boo with the first draft of that book. I'm just going to say it. You see, I was using his emails that he sends out for kind of like the voice Templar. We had had several calls. I had recorded those calls, transcribed those calls. I knew how he talked. I knew how he moved. The guy's from New Jersey. Okay. Picture everything you know about New Jersey guys. Yes, that's him. Yeah. Your stereotype is correct. And I say that with love. But in the first draft of the book that I created for him, oh dear, he came off a little too Goomba-ish. That's not the tone he was trying to strike. That is the tone that he puts in his emails, because the emails are going to other copywriters who, if you know copywriters, they're a salty bunch. Their feelings are not going to get hurt. However, this book I was producing for him goes to company founders in a variety of industries, any industry as a matter of fact. They might not be as appreciative of the tone that I originally generated. Y'all know when you're on a call with somebody and you can tell they're trying really hard not to be mean to you. Yeah, that was the vibe for our first revision call after I sent him the work. And God bless him, it was just, he was so nice. But yeah, we had to do a second pass. I had to do a full re-edit on the work that I had done because I needed to make sure I got the voice right. The voice and the tone. Yeah, it sounded like him, but it sounded like him after knocking back 3 beers and talking to his boys at the bowling alley. It did not sound like a man giving a professional presentation to successful business owners, which was what we were going for. The most important thing to ask is, who is the target audience for this book? Because that, in addition to the personality of the author, is going to determine how you edit. It's going to determine how you polish those sentences, how you move those paragraphs around, or which paragraphs you give the axe. Are you talking to middle-class stay-at-home moms, or are you talking to 24-year-old male aspiring copywriters? Do I need to tell you that the tone you strike is going to be very different for those two audiences? Of course you know that it will be. So yes, there is a higher per word rate for nonfiction, generally speaking. There are exceptions to this rule, but very often it's higher. And it's not arbitrary. It's not just because. It's because a lot more work goes into making sure that your book is saleable, making sure that it's informative, making sure your peers will think well of your book, and making sure your customers and even the layman reader will also like your book. That's the key to book sales. That's the key to building up your resume, I guess, as a thought leader. And that's the key to your book getting put on people's best of lists. And as your editor, that's kind of my job too. In addition to doing nonfiction editing and ghostwriting, I also do consults. So if you're not in a position where you want an editor or ghostwriter, but you just kind of want to talk over the structure of your nonfiction book before you let it out, there's a link in the description where you can book a consult with me and we can get to work making sure that you're not making any overt blunders before release day. So that's all I have for this week. Until next time, take care and write well.